This week we are going to cover another method for data collection. This entire unit we're basically covering the different areas: surveys, qualitative interviewing, and this week this topic is field research. Field research really encompasses two different methods of obtaining data. You're either making direct observations or you're asking questions. Sometimes it can be quantitative data, so that's data that's appropriate for statistical analysis, and sometimes qualitative data. These are observations that are not easily reduced to a number. Field research is not a rigid form of research, and it can change and flow. We need to take into account things such as time of day, location, where our observations take place, and from that we try to make sense out of an ongoing process. So, for example, we may want to do an analysis of cars parked in shopping malls. When is the best place to get that number? If we are looking to observe migrant workers, where is the best place to observe, and what is the best time frame? We are often generating theories or hypotheses that are grounded, or that are used with grounded theories. Then there's lots of topics that are appropriate to field research. When conditions or behaviors must be studied in their natural setting, field research is typically the best approach. The key strengths are the comprehensive perspective that it gives to the researcher. Many aspects of physical settings are probably best studied through direct observation. Although, I want to note, it's not always appropriate. Like if we were studying embezzlement, then doing that at someone's place of work is probably not the best location to conduct field research, right? Because you're observing illegal behavior. Validity is stronger. However, reliability can be an issue, because when you are observing something in the field, there are lots of things that can come into play that need to be taken into account. The observer can take on various roles. You can be a full participant, and that's where you are a genuine participant in what you are studying. There are some questions about ethics that you need to consider, and think about why that could possibly be a concern if you are a complete participant. One thing is that it can affect the social processes being studied. Just by you being there and being involved, you can have an influence. It's seldom possible in criminal justice institutions. And there's this concept called going native, where the researcher identifies too much with the interests and viewpoints of the participants, and so they're no longer an objective observer because they get too attached to the people that they are around. So once participants know you are there, their actions could change. So that's a big one. Observer as participant. This is where you identify yourself as a researcher, and then you interact with the participants, but you make no pretense of actually being a participant, so they know you're there just to observe. And it's great if you want to ask questions of the participants, so that's a good one. You can be a complete observer, and that's where you observe some location or process without becoming a part of it in any way. So literally all you are doing is observing. So let's talk just a little bit about sampling in field research. Controlled probability sampling is used rarely. Purposeful sampling is pretty common. You have a group that you are actively hoping to observe. You have to bear in mind two stages of sampling. To what extent are the situations available for observation of the general phenomenon that you hope to describe and explain? Are your actual observations within those total situations representative of all observations? And then consider how observations will vary, as I mentioned earlier, by time, space, weather dimensions. All of those things can come into play. Okay. Some other things that you would want to think about is as you are recording your observations, a wide variety of methods, from note-taking with pen and paper to video recording. You're going to be doing a field observation within this unit, so thinking about how you'll gather your data. You can use camera and sound recorders. However, note that you cannot capture everything. You're looking through a very limited view. Video cameras may be used in public places to record simple phenomenon. Still photographs may be appropriate to record some types of observations, such as if you were doing a field observation of graffiti or littering. Audio recorders can be useful for dictating observations, so instead of writing everything down, you're speaking into a recorder. When you're doing your field notes, you want to be very detailed. It can include everything, even including some unanticipated events, right? So as detailed as you can be, the better, because something could happen 10 minutes later that you wished you would have been documenting that time before. There are 3 basic guidelines. One is don't trust your memory. 2, take notes in stages. So when you're there, kind of take more sketchy notes and then rewrite the notes in detail very soon after, and then to record as much as possible. You can have structured observations. This is important if you need permission. Like, say you are wanting to observe prisoners or criminals, okay? It can be very structured. You are looking for particular things. So your field notes may be recorded on highly structured forms where the observers mark items in such a way that a survey interviewer could come back, another reviewer could come back and conduct the same observation. Many times we find that it's useful to combine field research with surveys or with data from official records. In the Baltimore study of the effects of neighborhood physical characteristics on residents' perceptions of crime problems, they used a perception survey, but then to identify physical problems, they made observations, actual population and crime information like census data and crime reports from police records, and so they combined. So then by combining them, you get a very rich overall picture. You have, in this example, the neighborhood's perception of the physical characteristics, and then looking at the crime problems as well. And some illustrations of field research that your textbook talks about is shoplifting. It's counted only when the offense is seen, takes place only in certain locations. It's a crime of stealth and not confrontation. The prevalence defined as ratio of shoplifters to shoppers. Okay? The subjects were selected by systematic sampling. Every 20th shopper was followed by a field observer. And then other research staff were employed as shoplifters to measure reliability of the observers' detections. So trying to, again, thinking about that reliability, if we're relying on our observer to recognize shoplifting, then we wanted to incorporate that test to make sure they were actually identifying shoplifters, and then could adjust prevalence rate with reliability figures. Another example, how many people wear seat belts, looking at the rate of use, the number of people wearing their seat belt versus the number of cars observed. Stationary observers at roadsides rather than mobile. placed at controlled intersections, and then they sampled cars on 3 dimensions: time of day, which could make a difference, roadway type, are we talking county road, are we talking interstate, are we talking middle of the city, downtown, and they stratified sites by density of auto ownership, which is correlated with population, and then they emphasized marking U when they were uncertain. So if they couldn't tell if someone was wearing their seatbelt or not, they marked it as a U. So when you're thinking about what you would like to do your field research on, I have had a wide variety of options or scenarios. I've had individuals who counted, they sat at a stoplight and they counted how many people ran the stoplight. I've had individuals go and observe soccer games. I've had them go to bars. I've had them go to funerals and just keep detailed field notes and then respond for the assignment for this week. Okay. Another example, bars of violence, alcohol, as you know if you've taken drugs and behavior, or even by experience being around individuals who may be drunk. It has a disinhibiting effect which can lead to aggression and subsequent violence. The researchers set out to learn how different situational factors could promote or inhibit violence in Australian bars and nightclubs. So the observers were in pairs and they stayed 2 to 6 hours multiple times at 23 sites. Okay? They were complete participants. So they wrote up their narratives later after they were finished. They looked at correlates, violence in bars frequented by working class males, discomfort and boredom, drinking patterns, management issues, like cover food availability, bouncers, and that sort of thing. There are some notable strengths and weaknesses of field research. Validity is usually a strength, but reliability and generalizability are sometimes weaknesses. You're looking at a very specific case, so trying to apply that to the general population becomes difficult. Some of the strengths, it gives you a depth of understanding. You can be more flexible. It's relatively inexpensive. When we look at validity, observation studies have the potential to yield measures that are more valid because you are simply reporting what you see. You're not making any assumptions when you're putting together your survey, for example. The weaknesses is that it very seldom can yield a precise descriptive statement about a large population. It's more specifically about the research that you're conducting at the current time. And precise probability samples cannot normally be drawn, so that becomes problematic when you think back to the chapter about sampling and how it's so important to have a random sample if you want to generalize it to the population. As far as reliability, field research measurements are often very personal. If you and I sat down and watched a soccer game, for example, or if we sat down and we were watching people go through an intersection, maybe I would count if it was at least 2 seconds after the yellow light, I counted that as running a red, where you looked at it as it had to be red, red, red before you would count it. So measurements can be often personal, or if there's something that you really want to look for, you can have those blinders. You really want to find it, so you're really looking hard for it. So it can be enhanced by careful attention to the details of observation, and it really goes back to how you set up your study. How do you define running a red light, for example? How do you define the purpose of your research? So it all goes together. It also increases the degree of interpretation required in making actual observations decreases. So if it's a pretty cut and dried observation, then your reliability is going to go up versus an observation where you're having to make more inferences. Generalizability can be an issue in two forms. One is that the personal nature of the observations and measurements can produce results that will not necessarily be able to be replicated by another independent researcher. And then it's very comprehensive understanding of subject matter, but less generalizable than results based on rigorous sampling and standardized measurements and those sorts of things. So precise probability samples just really can't normally be drawn. So this chapter is a relatively short chapter, but it gives you an overview of field research that's conducted in a natural setting. And I want you to think about what the benefits of that can be if individuals are in their natural setting. You're getting great feedback on how they actually interact with each other. So field research is a data collection method that involves the direct observation of a phenomenon in its natural setting. It's usually the preferred data collection method for obtaining information about physical or social settings, behaviors, events, those sorts of things. Field research in criminal justice may produce either qualitative or quantitative data. If I'm simply counting how many cars run through a red light, that's quantitative data. I'm simply reporting a number. Grounded theory is typically built from qualitative field observations, or observations that can be quantified may produce measures for hypothesis testing, for example. So a field observation sometimes can lead to additional studies. Observations made through field research can often be integrated with data that's collected from other resources. So in this way, field observations can help researchers interpret other data or understand it more fully or get a better picture. Asking questions through a form of specialized interviewing is also often integrated with field observation. So field researchers may or may not identify themselves as researchers to the people they are observing. And we talked about some pros and cons, and your textbook goes into a bit more detail. Being identified as a researcher may have an effect on what you observe, because when people know you're there to observe them, they're going to change. Preparing for the field involves negotiating or arranging access to your subject. So going back to what we talked last chapter, how do you gain access to your subjects? How do you gain access, for example, if you're looking at a subculture? Maybe you're looking at a defense attorney and drug dealers. Okay, you might have to use an informant to get to individuals who are drug dealers and look at how they are defended. And then sometimes you need to use snowball sampling, where informants identify other persons who might also become subjects. So maybe you identify one drug dealer, okay, based on an informant that you have a relationship with. From that drug dealer, you establish a rapport. They may pass another name on to you if they become comfortable with you. Okay. Let me see, what else do I want to say here? In some circumstances, researchers can combine probability and non-probability sampling. So as I mentioned, snowball sampling is a method for acquiring an ever-increasing number of sample observations where one participant's asked to recommend. Alternatives for recording field observations that we talked about this week is video, audio, other equipment to unstructured field notes. Okay, I can run the gamut. In between are observations recorded on structured forms. You have specific things that you want to look for. Environmental surveys are a good example. Field notes should be planned in advance to the greatest extent possible. You need to have an idea of what you want to be looking for. However, note-taking should be flexible enough to make records of those unexpected observations. So compared with surveys, field research methods generally have more validity but less reliability, and field research results typically cannot be generalized as safely as those that are based on rigorous sampling and standardized questionnaires. So one of the things that I hope you come out of this class with is an understanding that there are lots of ways to gather data. You have surveys, you have interviews, you have field observations. Next chapter we're going to talk about content analyses, and there are pros and cons to each type of data collection. And that's where it becomes so critical, and as you're putting your proposal together, thinking about what is my question and how am I going to answer it. Because once you have that question solidified, then there are usually comes to the forefront the best ways to gather that information.